Welcome to Leaders of Life Sciences, the podcast where we spotlight the people shaping the future of pharma and biotech. Each episode, we speak with founders, senior execs, scientists, and strategists about how they lead, what drives them, and the real impact they're making on teams, organizations, and the lives of patients. If you want fresh insight into what great leadership looks like in life sciences, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. Hi, Michael. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Nice to be with you today, Will.
Thank you very much for spending the time. It's great to have you on. I think with your over 2 decades of experience shaping medical affairs and leading in pharma companies, thought you'd be a great voice to have on, and haven't changed my opinion on that in all the lead up and the conversations we've had up until this point. Do you mind just giving us a bit of an introduction to who you are and how you came to this point in your career?
Sure. Well, I trained as a clinician in infectious diseases, and I saw patients at a couple clinics for 7 years in New York City during the height of the HIV epidemic before we had really effective therapies. I also focused on other infectious diseases like hepatitis C. And then after doing that, I decided to join the biopharmaceutical industry. And I landed in medical affairs, first as MSL, then a manager of MSLs, and then various roles throughout until I ended up leading medical affairs, both at Abbott and then AbbVie.
Awesome.
And I retired 3 years ago and joined Boston Consulting Group, BCG, where I focus on medical affairs and R&D issues for that firm at this time.
Awesome. And you retired and yet you still keep your hand in. What keeps you passionate about staying in the industry and continuing to contribute?
Well, science and medicine are interesting, and when we do it right, we have an impact on people's lives. We reduce suffering, we advance the way we diagnose or treat or have health outcomes in a society. That's what drove me 35, 40 years ago to enter medicine and science. And here, close to my 60th birthday, I still am excited about what science and medicine can do to improve people's lives.
So that's what got you into it. It's what keeps you in it still.
Absolutely. And it's just interesting stuff.
What do you find most interesting about it? You said the word interesting probably 3 or 4 times so far. What is it that for you
Well,
is
it's new.
so
You're
interesting?
figuring out how something works, a biologic system that's gone awry and causing somebody suffering, is causing a disease. And figuring that out and how to reverse that with an antibody, a drug, a cell therapy, a gene alteration. Those are incredibly complex processes that we're getting pretty good at figuring out. And that's why you see so much innovation coming in this space. And so I don't want to just leave it behind and let others do it. I want to be part of it too.
So it's retirement from the things that you don't any longer want to do, and not retirement from the things you still love.
You've said it perfect right there.
Yeah.
You know, any job has things that aren't particularly interesting or what you want to do, but you got to do it because it's a job. When you get to my age, you know, you get to pick, hey, I'm going to stay doing this fun stuff and I'm going to drop this stuff that's not so fun.
You've held some big roles and you've got some pretty big exposure at the moment with some of the companies that you help and you advise. What are the things that you're most excited about in the space, in the world at the moment that you're seeing from your viewpoint?
Well, I'm incredibly excited about those scientific advances. We're at a time where our progress in understanding of disease and how to interrupt and reverse and maybe even cure many that were thought to be uncurable is profound. And it's as rapid and changing and exciting as any time during my lifetime. That's the positive side. The negative side is the industry is going through a lot of transformation, a lot of stressors on it. And I think the next couple of years are going to be difficult for the industry. I would say the next 5 years probably, from a profit and loss standpoint, from a business model standpoint. And so you've got this dynamic where science and medicine is giving us new tools and ways to actually produce product in these companies that can have a real impact on people's lives. but the business model is being stretched right now.
I'm sure this is very much a finger in the air kind of a question that I'm going to ask, but what's your view? What do you think the implications are of kind of where we're heading at the moment?
So I don't know. And anybody that says they do, I don't know that I'd put much stock in that. I think what we do know is the profitability, how much profit per pill or profit per injection is going to come down. And that's going to be driven by a few dynamics. You've got this tariff looming over us. So if you buy cheap raw materials someplace else and you import them for manufacturing, that keeps your profit high and your costs down. That's probably might change some. The US, for the last better part of 50 years, has paid a higher price for medicine than anywhere else in the world. And that's about to change for a number of reasons. You got an aging society. It's costly to buy medicines for more people in your society need them because you've got more aging people. And so the US is running these huge deficits, and healthcare is a big cost in our national government. And so really, whether one party or the other party is in charge, the US consumer and the US health system has to pay less for drugs and medicines than they have in the past. And so that's another stressor that's absolutely going to hit this industry. And we're just at the beginning of understanding what that looks like. How far does the US costs fall? If the US costs fall a lot, or price. If the US price falls a lot, or the amount that companies are able to make in the United States, then it's got to change its whole model. Or out of Europe and Australia and Canada and Japan, and those countries aren't going to be very enthusiastic about paying more. So we're at this flux where the industry is not sure what its business model is going to be just a few years from now.
Yeah, and then you've got more investment coming into Europe, more investment going into the Middle East. So there are competing regions. It's an interesting time.
Yeah,
Very
and China's
interesting
probably
time.
the biggest one out of those, where China has both the raw materials for the medicines that we sell, but it also has now the technical prowess and science. It doesn't rival Europe and the United States yet, but it's getting close. And there are a lot of scientists in China who are doing some amazing work and are going to have their impact on medicines of the future for sure.
So I'm not going to be able to pin you down on an exact answer to this. We've got to make do with, let's see what happens.
Be comfortable with some ambiguity, and we'll figure it out,
Yeah,
because
it always gets figured out, right?
it gets
It always
figured
gets
out,
figured out.
right? Especially, think about it. What are the wealthy of the world going to spend their money on? And I'm talking about relative wealth, like the United States, like Europe. Healthcare. You got an aging population. What are you going to spend your resources on? Your wealth in your country? Healthcare. And so whether we know the exact particulars of how the industry is going to maintain and grow its profit, no. But what we do know is there's a huge amount of value if you alleviate pain, suffering, diseases, extend longevity. And that's what the industry does with science and medicine.
Yeah, which I guess brings us on nicely to one of the topics that we talked about in the build up that you were really passionate about in terms of elevating standards of care and patient centricity. And for you, what does that mean in today's kind of life sciences landscape, and how's your approach to that changed throughout your career?
Well, I view what we do in industry as just an extension of clinical care. We're doing pharmaceutical medicine, right? We're not seeing an individual patient in front of us, but we're seeing populations of patients, large numbers. And so we're a partner with the healthcare provider that you're seeing, whether that be a nurse, a doctor, whatever. And our goal is to deliver medicines that are anchored in robust evidence that they work, that we understand their safety profile and their dosing, that they're consistently manufactured. And that's a real key part of modern medicine. And when we do our best work, we help the frontline medical providers, whether they be in the emergency room or the primary care suite or the oncology suite, understand the latest and greatest that medical therapeutics or devices can offer. And so that's where I took my career, into the medical side of the pharmaceutical industry, where our goal is to tell the science stories coming out of our company. That can be through press releases, through scientific congresses, through scientific peer-reviewed publications. That can be face-to-face, going into doctors' offices or hospitals and teaching. And that's a critical role for us in industry.
So on that point then, and with it being a critical role within the industry, what do you think that people who are in it for those reasons, i.e. getting the best outcomes for patients, etc., what should they be aware of? Like, what should they be thinking of? How should they be approaching what they do to make sure that the patient is at the center, or those that are delivering the healthcare are at the forefront of the mind of the industry?
It does. Well, I would start by saying, I hope everybody that works in a company, let's take one of the large companies like Johnson & Johnson. They've got devices, they've got pharmaceuticals, innovative medicines, they call it, and they've got, I don't know, somewhere around 150,000 employees. I hope that every one of them, whether they work in the cafeteria or they're cleaning the buildings or they're working in medical affairs like I did, or clinical development or discovery or safety or regulatory or sales, that they wake up every day with the patient as the North Star, the anchor for what they're doing. That's why you work in this industry and not Coca-Cola or computers or cars. And so, again, when we do our best work, everybody at the company knows why we're there and what we're trying to accomplish. Now, some of us chose careers in pharmaceutical medicine that are on the front lines of communication, front lines of elevating standards of care, front lines of partnering with outside healthcare providers who are in direct patient care to make sure they have the information, the understanding, elevate and challenge their practice of medicine, hopefully influence and change their practice of medicine. Because the volume of publications that come out every day, the number of new therapeutic interventions that are available from the time when somebody, say, leaves medical school, where their job is mostly learning, to when they're in practice, where they're trying to see, depending on the specialty, 30 plus patients a day. We play a critical role then in helping keep them current on the standards of care and elevating those standards of care. We're a real partner with them on that journey. And that's why I chose and stayed my entire career in the medical affairs space, because I found that to be professionally rewarding.
You said you hope that everybody in the industry wakes up with that mentality. From your experience, how true is that? How many people do you think do wake up with that real belief or feeling that they're in it for the patients, they're in it for the people that benefit from what they do?
I think that that's the predominant attitude that I experienced throughout my career. Now, do you interact with individuals in large organizations who may be bitter or going through something in their personal? Of course. But for the most part, people go into science and medicine to make a difference in others' lives. And those of us who got medical training, whether it be as a pharmacist or a chemist or a doctor, who migrated into the pharmaceutical industry, do so because they're stable jobs, they're well paid, they're well resourced to actually do your research. They're places where you can, as I said before, affect populations as opposed to individuals. So there's a lot of reasons, and it's paid well. So there's a lot of reasons that professionals from the medical side, the science side, migrate into the industry. And I don't think that changes over time because they're maybe better compensated than somebody working at the FDA or the MHRA or somebody working at a university or at a hospital. The pay scale is different for the industry than it is for those other places in healthcare. But I can tell you that I still interacted on a daily basis with a majority of people who were anchored in alleviating human suffering improving medical care and trying very hard for cures for things that are very difficult to understand and to cure, actually.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the really exciting things about doing this podcast and speaking to senior people in the industry is seeing how rooted people are in that sense of purpose and giving. And I actually, not just in terms of what they give back for the patients, but even in terms of how willing people are to give time through this podcast to educate the audience and how willing they are to connect you with good people. There's a lot of very heart-centered leaders that we've had the privilege of speaking to so far, and certainly gives a good reflection on the industry, which typically doesn't necessarily have a great reputation at the, perhaps at the general population level.
It doesn't. We're right with the oil companies and the tobacco companies. And that makes me sad because it is populated with people who have the best intention for population health and individual health. But the complexities, I think the cost of the medicines, I think particularly in the United States with direct-to-consumer advertising, it leads to a lack of clear understanding of how the industry works, how critical it is to the healthcare you get today. We go back 120 years ago, and the tools in a doctor's bag were nothing they are today. There it was about observation, some surgical interventions, infrequently, a medicine. Fast forward 125 years, and what do we see? The bulk of our therapeutic interventions today are medical. They're pretty damn successful. I don't care what disease you want to look at. Migraine headache, high blood pressure, doesn't matter. We've got agents that came out of this industry that are actually quite effective at that. And when you look around the globe, 90, I don't know, +% of them are really cheap. They're generic and they're incredibly effective. But the bulk of the attention comes to the 7 to 9% of the innovation that's new, protected by patents, very costly, and lead to challenges with access, where certain parts of the world just don't have access to that innovation at all. And the parts of the world that have access to it, sometimes individuals can't afford it, or their portion of what they would have to pay to afford it.
Given what you've done in your career, Michael, and the 2 decades in med affairs, how has the function role changed within the industry during that time, during your experience?
Well, when I joined, it was at a time when there were some abuses on the medical side of industry that led them to be a bit more commercial and salesy. So do you want to hire doctors and nurses and pharmacists and have them do the same thing that you have your sales reps doing? Probably not. And when I joined the industry, some of that was happening. So that led to, in part, a whole bunch of changes in the industry because particularly the US government, the rest of the governments around the world didn't get very involved with this. They did some of this, but the US government in particular, around the turn of the century, took these companies to court, put in rules around separation between what you're doing on the science side and what you're doing on the sales and marketing side. And so I got to work through the industry setting up those rules where the medical teams are pretty independent now and have been for the last better part of 15 years plus, making sure that when somebody asks us a question, we're not answering them with respect to our product preference or to protect our product. We're answering them with the independent scientific knowledge that we've garnered through our education and through our clinical experience. And so that's a fun place to be in a company that, again, pays well, gives you a career path, and medical affairs gets to do a lot of sciencey medical stuff, like answering questions, like publishing scientific papers, like going to conferences, like running advisory boards with the top experts in the world to understand and advance our science and our medicine's development, like going into hospitals and clinics and practices, learning about the day-to-day challenges that the patients and the health system are having related to a certain disease, and then helping co-create solutions. This is an exciting place for anybody who cares about clinical care to work. And the government around the world have given us some freedom to do that. They understand that you need some freedom to be able to have scientific exchange, to not be constrained just by your product's label, which is what our sales and marketing teams are, because that's what we studied, that's what we're approved for being able to sell. But the medical team has a bit more freedom to speak expansively about the disease as well as the potential for a medicine that may be outside of its particular product label. So again, I think it's an exciting part of the pharmaceutical environment, and it's one that I would say is growing. When I work across the industry, many medical departments are either static or growing. That is different than a lot of places in pharma where you're seeing some contraction. And I don't know that that growth in our medical departments will be continual. I think AI is going to have a dramatic impact on medical departments and professional roles that the machines frankly do better, like spell checking and font size and footnotes and consistent with what we've published in the past. The algorithms just do it better than humans and faster. So I think some of this will change how many people we need in certain roles, but we're just at the beginning stages of that for the industry.
Yeah, it's an interesting time for all departments, and I've spoken to a couple of people in med affairs who are pretty worried about it. So I think they'll be glad to hear that it's just at the beginning and it's not coming for them just yet.
I wouldn't be overly worried. I mean, it's just it's just another tool. Humans aren't going to be replaced anytime soon, but human and the algorithm are probably going to be the better combination and the better output, which is better for patients, which is better for the doctor trying to understand, because you're going to just have a higher quality and a faster response time. But the downside is there will be some human displacement. There will have to be some skill adjustment, but I don't see humans going away anytime soon in medicine.
How do you think it'll work in tandem then? What's your prediction on that?
Well, in general, you don't have enough healthcare providers to cover the population. So I'm talking outside of the industry. Let's just look at medicine. Do we have enough healthcare providers to cover the humans on Earth? Hell no. Do we have enough of them in even the wealthiest countries? No. So how do we take these new tools, a virtual doctor, and have them expand what our human doctors are doing, our human care providers are doing? And that's the combination that probably is the next step. And the question is, how do you regulate those? How do you get the unions to be accepting of that? Because one could imagine the AMA is not going to be too excited about a algorithm that's allowed to write a prescription. But I ultimately think we get there. And if we don't in the richest countries, then it's the poorest countries that will lead maybe on better healthcare. Because they don't have a choice. One doctor per 10,000 people, it's just not practical. So you've got to deploy this technology to give people a better chance at better health.
Yeah, really interesting, really interesting. And I think there'll be parts where how long will it take for people to trust anything driven AI? I mean, you're hearing it in all walks of life at the moment with, AI customer service reps and AI sales reps and all sorts. I guess the question will be if it can do the job just as well, then why wouldn't you trust it?
Well, look, we have a problem with trust in medicine already. We have it in vaccines. We have it in the pharmaceutical industry. And we talked about that earlier here at this podcast. Of course, you're going to have it in algorithms and AI that are sound in medical diagnosis and medical recommendations. But some people aren't going to trust it. And so just like we've got to do work in other parts of gaining people's trust, we'll have to do that with this technology as well.
And one of the points that we talked about in the lead up was around leadership and leadership in the context of communicating the science and bringing colleagues along and bringing people in the space along. How do you think that leaders do this effectively? How do they do it well? And then on the counter, what happens when it's done badly?
Well, whether you're working in the hospital or working in the pharmaceutical industry, it's sort of the same skills. How do you build team dynamics? How do you listen rather than just direct? How do you mobilize a group of people to accomplish a goal? In our industry, there are certain things you have to do just by the cookbook, by the regulations. And so you don't have a lot of freedom around that. But what we do have a lot of freedom around is how do we communicate amongst ourselves? How do we share best practices? How do we measure our success? How do these are things that leaders with their team are charged with co-creating. And I think the model of co-creating, because, especially people that work in my field, the medical department, they're all going to be really bright people with advanced scientific degrees. And so coming in and telling them how to do their job, how to think about science and medicine, how to communicate it, is probably not going to be a very successful approach to leadership. It's really a partnership. It's really empowering people. It's really challenging them, giving them clarity on how they can grow, both in their skills as well as their professional development and career path. And certainly, whether it be a large company or small companies, in this industry, there are a myriad of career paths for these professionals to go. And that's another benefit of working in the industry, as opposed to, say, academic, which is more limited in that you have a small management in academics and mostly an individual contributor, a professor, a lab, someone that runs a lab. So very few options. You come into industry and the options are unbelievable. I mean, you can work with population health and insurers to make sure the medicines are available and get on government formularies or into insurance companies. You can work in discovery. You can work in development. You can work in safety. You can work in medical affairs. You can work in sales and marketing. There is a myriad of paths and trails that your career can take based on your appetite and interest. The best leaders help guide their staff along that journey.
How have you done that in your career? Like when you look at how you've effectively led teams, led people, what do you put that down to?
I think for me, the secret sauce is being willing to try to understand what your staff are going through, what their challenges are, making sure you know the science and the medicine as well as you can so that there's not a vast difference between management and worker on the actual data related to any particular asset that you're working on. And I see some companies fall down that way, and that management just becomes around running the organization and the team and loses some connection to the details of the science. And I think teams that have managers that are less proficient in the science and medicine sometimes struggle with communicating the realities of what's happening in clinical care today or what the data is or isn't telling us.
How would you advise, let's say somebody's in that kind of a situation at the moment, like how would you advise people to avoid that kind of a situation arising? I know one of the other things we discussed in the lead up to this was around leaders that might not have a deep scientific background but are still tasked with guiding the scientific teams. What advice would you give for people that are in those kind of situations or in those shoes at the moment?
Read, learn, attend conferences, There's so much information available to us that we can all have a certain sophistication pretty quickly. And I would encourage folks to make sure that you can challenge teams on the substance of the science and medicine and communications around an asset. And that makes the team stronger. That makes the people working on the product also know that you understand where they're living, where they're working. Co-create solutions with them.
Clearly, it has its limitations. Do you think it? Do you think it works? Do you think it
I
can work?
do. I think the companies where management is deeply involved with the specifics of a disease, with the specifics of the medicine and the other therapeutic options are the companies that do the best.
And another point that we discussed beforehand, and you were quite honest about this, was around your leadership and the skills required for success. When you look back, what kind of leadership skills do you wish that you know perhaps paid more attention to, or developed?
I think it was only later in my career that I gave any consideration or even awareness that leadership itself was its own domain. That's probably pretty naive, but where my strength lied was in science and medicine, was in strategy. And those are great skills to have. But in your leaders, what you want are people who are masters of culture and communication and listening and group dynamics. And those are more general people skills and business skills. And there are routes to add those to one's armamentarium through graduate education, through external workshops. I simply never paid much attention to any of that till the latter part of my career. If I had to do my career over again and I wanted to go down the management route again, I would have focused much more of that on that earlier in my career rather than waiting till I ran into some problems to then try to gain those skills because I wasn't being as successful with teams as I wanted to be. I was so linearly focused on science, medicine. Let's cure Hep C. Let's cure HIV. Let's cure rheumatoid arthritis. Right? And these, these were my obsessions. And I would say for leaders and managers, I want to see obsessions around people and culture and some scientific curiosity and involvement. But the domain that matters more is the things that make managers successful.
Do you think you'd have followed the same path?
Perhaps. I mean, perhaps at the, latter part of my career when I recognized that those skills weren't beyond my reach. But boy, it's hard to take somebody like me and a lot of folks who go into medicine or end up in pharmaceutical medicine. We just have a passion and a curiosity around science and medicine and data. So you're going to have a lot of profiles that are not dissimilar to mine.
Great skills to have, though, that kind of curiosity, just pointed in a slightly different direction, and it's the curiosity into the person, and which you alluded to earlier about paying attention to what matters to the individual and what they're passionate about and where they want to go with their career. But I guess it takes a redirection of that focus as opposed to a linear kind of following of it.
That's right. It's just expanding skill sets, spending a little less time in the data and a little bit more time in human science.
Nice. You've mentioned roles like again in the lead up, like drug developers, customer facing, storytellers, that they're always going to be skills that are required. They're always going to be people that are needed in the industry. What's your philosophy on that? Like, why do you see those as integral, regardless of what kind of markets bring?
I just don't think you replace the human when it comes to explaining something new. And, we'll have apps we can go to. We have things as healthcare providers that you can rely on to get information. But having a relationship with someone who developed something, who understands intimately the depth of the science behind and how you arrived at anything, a dose, the way you infuse something. I mean, there's nuance there that a flat algorithm just won't give you. And so I do think that not unlike any other kind of industry, there's going to be a role. It may be a different, smaller role. It may be a modified role for sales, for medical, for regulatory professionals. Again, maybe we get to a place where AI can put together our regulatory package, but I still think there's going to be a role for human regulatory experts to interact with the regulatory professionals at the agencies to help them understand the journey, why we made decisions we made, what we believe and interpret from the data, how we contextualize that in the paradigm of that disease and how it's treated today. I don't think that these are skills that are going to be replaceable by software. It will just be complemented with software. But humans are amazing, and we're going to stay at the forefront of science and medicine. And this is going to remain a highly regulated, complex, for the right reasons, industry. Because you don't want to hurt somebody, because you don't want to be selling something, particularly something that costs a lot of money, that doesn't work. And that's where we were 125 years ago, right? Medicines were sold, they just didn't have a lot of discipline around them. And that discipline, what do I mean by discipline? That means they weren't well studied. They were opinions. They weren't, even if they did work, they weren't manufactured in a way that every time you took it, you got the same thing.
So any advice for people out there at the moment who are trying to make their career in what is a very complex and fast moving environment? Any little nuggets, Michael?
If you want to work in the biopharmaceutical industry, there are two really great places to anchor yourself before you transition it. One is clinical care, and the second is academic labs. And both of those are great places, academia, to come into, or sometimes what we're seeing right now, particularly in the United States, you have a migration out of the regulatory or government agencies into industry. That in the past has not been such a high volume thing. It is, because of what we're going through in America right now, higher than usual. But academia has always fed into industry, and clinical practice has always fed into industry. So if you run into a dead end today because you just graduated and industry doesn't take you on as an employee immediately, get yourself anchored in clinical care or in academic research and keep trying. The door will open one day. There's a lot of people that work in this industry. This industry is not going to be static. It's going to continue to expand and grow. We have tremendous unmet need for elevating health around the globe. And there's an infinite number of diseases and molecules and approaches that are yet to be discovered, and you can be part of that.
Nice, a motivating way to begin the wrap up of the podcast. And how about that's for people perhaps trying to make their career, and if you're looking at it from the other end, and people that are leading in the industry at the moment, and leading, let's say specifically in and around med affairs, like what wisdom or advice would you leave with them?
Always, for my medical affairs colleagues, is the highest scientific standards. That doesn't mean isolated from your business. Hell no. But what it means is, you're hired and you're in these roles in medical affairs because, in fact, you have the scientific acumen to understand what the patient needs, what the science of the competitor products bring, and how to appropriately tell the story of your product that's based in science, data, evidence, and credibility. And so what we don't want to do, if we're trying to, like I hope many of us are, raise the understanding in the general public of the industry, is do anything that brings rapport, hits at our credibility, our scientific credibility. Academics need us to be credible partners. Clinicians need us to be credible partners. Regulators and governments need us to be credible partners. And that means staying true to the science, the evidence, and bringing that voice and perspective of the patient into what the companies are trying to do, which is invent products that sell and make money for the stockholders.
Michael, thanks so much for being willing to give up your time and give us some of your wisdom and advice. and guidance. If anybody wants to connect with Michael after this, give us a shout and we can hook you up. But thanks a lot, Michael. Really appreciate your time. Really enjoyed the conversation, and we'll speak soon.
Thanks, Will. Nice chatting with you.
Nice to speak with you too. Take care. Thanks for listening to Leaders of Life Sciences. We hope you're leaving with fresh ideas and inspiration to lead with clarity and purpose. If you're hiring, building your leadership team, or thinking about your next move, we'd love to support you. You'll find everything you need to get in touch in the show notes. And if you enjoyed the show, please follow and share it with someone who'd find it valuable. Until next time, keep leading forward.